She held a PhD in molecular biology. He was a quiet man with too many secrets and too few words. Their daughter? A brilliant teenager with a cello in one hand and the world in the other. On the surface, it was a family that belonged on glossy brochures and college recruitment billboards. Behind closed doors, though, it was something else entirely, a place where silence had sharp edges, and love came with conditions so precise they could have been written in a lab notebook. This is not the kind of story that begins with a bang. It begins quietly, with measured glances, a sterilized kitchen, and a mother who smiled without ever really meaning it. Because what happens when the person who raised you doesn't see you as their child, but as a threat? When the very hands that nurtured you begin to chart your downfall like an experiment gone wrong? This is the story of Yolani Fang-Baskins. And the people who should have protected her. So before we dissect this suburban symphony of control, delusion, and calculated violence, hit follow. Because this case, it isn't about the monsters under the bed. It's about the ones who tuck you in. The house on Thistle Oak Lane was immaculate. Not just clean, sterilized. Every surface gleamed under LED track lighting, every corner vacuumed into silence. The walls were bare, save for strategically placed awards, framed certificates, and family portraits so choreographed they could have passed for stock images. To an outsider, it was the home of the American dream incarnate. Two accomplished parents raising a brilliant child in the kind of neighborhood where mailboxes matched and lawns were violations waiting to happen. But step inside, stay a while, and you'd feel it, that heaviness, like the air had been filtered of all joy. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was engineered. Xiaodan Fang was the architect of that silence. 41 years old, born in Beijing, and the proud holder of a PhD in molecular biology, Xiaodan didn't just crave control, she worshipped it. She had been raised by parents who believed failure was a moral flaw, and she carried that legacy with surgical precision. Even after leaving the lab years ago, her life remained one long, unending experiment. Every variable, her diet, her marriage, her daughter, had to be calibrated to perfection. She spoke in clipped syllables, dressed like a boardroom mannequin, and never once left the house without her eyeliner sharp as a scalpel. To those around her, she was poised and graceful, a portrait of restraint. But beneath the skin was something brittle, cracking slowly beneath the weight of her expectations. Baskins, Dell to the few who knew him, was her husband. 43. African American. A gentle soul, soft-spoken and endlessly loyal, but adrift in a storm of his own making. Dell had once been a rising star in aerospace engineering, gifted with machines but clumsy with people. Diagnosed with bipolar disorder in his 20s, he managed well enough with medication, until Xiaodan entered the picture. What he mistook for stability in her was something far more insidious. She didn't scream. She didn't hit. But over time, she dismantled him. Quietly. Strategically. She rationed affection, ridiculed his instincts, corrected him like a faulty machine. And he, too passive, too afraid to confront the slow erosion of his identity, let her. He loved her, or the version of her he married. The one who had smiled at his poetry and traced his palm with her fingers like she was memorizing his story. But that version had been a mirage, and now, he was living with the scientist who had outgrown her test subject. And then there was Yolani. At 16, Yolani Fang-Baskins was everything a parent could ask for, if that parent weren't Xiaodan. She was trilingual, fluent in Mandarin, French, and English. She played the cello like she was born with the bow in her hand, volunteered at the library on weekends, aced her AP classes, and still found time to help her classmates study. Teachers adored her. Neighbors beamed at her. Even Dell, in his fog of confusion and detachment, recognized her as something extraordinary. But none of it was enough. Not for Xiaodan. Especially not for Xiaodan. Because Yolani wasn't just expected to succeed, she was expected to transcend. She didn't know she was adopted, Xiaodan never told her. Never slipped. Never hinted. The truth was filed away like a failed trial, irrelevant to the experiment in progress. But for Xiaodan, the lie was layered in resentment. This girl, this perfect girl, was not hers by blood. And that fact festered beneath her skin like a virus she couldn't eradicate. She masked her disdain behind clinical supervision. Scheduled everything. Meals, sleep, study time, even emotional check-ins that felt more like data collection. She installed cameras in Yolani's bedroom under the guise of safety. The fridge was locked, pantry too. Hugs were rationed. Compliments scripted and delivered like performance reviews. Dell watched, at first with unease, then with numb acceptance. Xiaodan told him it was necessary. That Yolani's mind was a rare gift, and it had to be handled with precision. He wanted to believe her. So he stopped asking questions. Stopped fighting. Stopped noticing how often his daughter's smile looked practiced. The house on Thistle Oak Lane looked like success. But inside, it was a vacuum, a place where joy was monitored, mistakes catalogued, and love came with prerequisites. The lights were always on. The walls were always white. And the quiet? The quiet was engineered. It began with a whisper. A subtle, offhand comment, dropped like a seed into Cordell's already fragile mind. "Did you see how she was looking at you today?" Xiaodan asked one night as she folded laundry with robotic precision. Her voice was soft, almost amused. Dell looked up from the couch, startled. "Who?" he asked. "Yolani," she said, without making eye contact. "You didn't notice?" Maybe I'm imagining things." She wasn't. She was orchestrating. For months, Xiaodan had been carefully, almost artfully, chipping away at the foundation of her daughter's identity. Not by yelling or grounding or overt cruelty. No, Xiaodan was a woman of science. She knew that poison worked better in small doses. She started subtly. Yolani's phone mysteriously disappeared one evening. When it turned up 2 days later, Xiaodan handed it to her with a tight-lipped smile and a warning, "Be more careful. Some of your messages weren't appropriate." Yolani was confused, she hadn't sent anything unusual. But Dell, who happened to walk by at that moment, looked down at the girl with a flicker of uncertainty. "The kind that lingers. The kind that spreads." Then came the clothes. A lace bralette found tucked under the driver's seat of Dell's car. A pregnancy test in the bathroom trash can, used, faintly positive, and wrapped in Yolani's music theory homework. Dell didn't want to believe it, but Xiaodan didn't give him space to doubt. "She's unraveling," she said, her voice drenched in solemn disappointment. "I've tried to help her, Dell. But she's not the girl we raised. I think." A pause, calculated. "I think she's dangerous." At first, Dell resisted. He loved Yolani. He remembered her tiny fingers clinging to his pinky the day they brought her home. Her obsession with constellations, how she used to wake him up at 3 a.m. just to see Orion's belt. But Dell wasn't well. Not anymore. His medication had been quietly swapped, Xiaodan had started managing his pills, claiming forgetfulness was leading to double dosing. What he didn't realize was that she was adjusting his dosage, day by day, throwing his mood into a tailspin. And in that fog of altered chemistry, the impossible started to feel plausible. Xiaodan escalated. She showed him fabricated texts, doctored screenshots of Yolani supposedly messaging Dell's coworker, an old college friend named Marcus. Flirty language, coded invitations, innuendo that felt foreign coming from his daughter's name. He asked her about it once, choking on the words. Yolani looked at him like he'd grown another head. "What are you talking about?" She laughed nervously. "Marcus? He's like an uncle to me." But Dell's eyes had changed. And so had his ears. Because Xiaodan's voice was now the loudest in his head. "She's manipulating you, Xiaodan whispered one night, her back turned to him in bed. She learned how to mimic affection. That's what sociopaths do. Dell flinched. She's not a sociopath, he muttered. But it didn't sound convincing, even to himself. Then Xiaodan leaned in, her voice a scalpel. She's not your daughter anymore. She's the disease. The word struck like a lightning bolt, fusing paranoia with paternal instinct. Dell started watching Yelani differently, tracking her movements, questioning her motives. He stopped calling her sweetheart. Stopped answering her texts. One day, she tried to hug him, and he stepped back like she was contagious. He thought he was protecting the family. But he was dismantling it, one delusion at a time. Xiaodan watched it all unfold with the cold detachment of someone dissecting a rat. Yelani, the perfect daughter, the ideal construct, had become the threat. Her beauty was weaponized, her kindness rewritten as seduction, her brilliance reframed as manipulation. In Xiaodan's mind, it wasn't jealousy. It was justice. The lie had lived too long in her house, breathing her air, soaking up praise she believed should have been hers, or never given at all. Yelani, meanwhile, began to unravel. Not because she knew what was happening, but because she didn't. Her world was shifting beneath her feet, but no one told her why. She felt hunted in her own home, stared at like a stranger by the man who used to carry her on his shoulders through the state fair. Her mother had never been warm, but this was new, silence so sharp it lacerated. At dinner, Xiaodan smiled too wide. Dell didn't look up at all. The house on Thistle Oak Lane was quiet. But this time, the quiet was grief, gaslit into confusion. And the echoes bouncing through the hallways weren't just footsteps. They were the beginning of a shattering. The call came at 3:12 a.m., a scream sharp enough to slice through the silence of Thistle Oak Lane. A neighbor, half asleep and trembling, dialed 911 and reported what they thought was a violent fight or maybe an animal. But when the officers arrived at 1421 Thistle Oak, there were no signs of chaos. No broken windows. No blood on the carpet. Just a house so clean it smelled wrong, sterile, like a surgery ward. Xiaodan and Dell were in the kitchen, drinking tea. She wore a silk robe, pale blue, knotted precisely at her waist. Dell sat motionless beside her, still in his work shirt, sleeves rolled to his elbows. Their hands wrapped around matching porcelain cups. Steam floated upward. The only warmth in the room. "Is something wrong, officers?" Xiaodan asked, tilting her head slightly. Her voice was calm, so calm it made the hair on the back of one rookie's neck stand up. They swept the house. Living room, pristine. Bathroom, lemon-scented, polished. Yelani's bedroom, made bed, cello leaning neatly in the corner, textbooks aligned like soldiers. No clothes on the floor. No chaos. But something felt dead. A staleness, like a room that hadn't been lived in for days. The officers split up. One noticed the hallway closet. Another clocked the faint chemical sting in the air, bleach, heavy and recent. Then came the footprint in the attic dust, partial, adult-sized, facing toward the crawlspace. A section of the linen closet wall felt off. The panel didn't sit flush. A few screws had been hastily refastened, but the alignment was imperfect. As if it had been done under pressure. Or in the dark. They pried it open. Inside was silence. And then, her. Yelani's body was curled inward like a fallen fawn. One arm twisted beneath her, the other draped across her chest. Her hair was soaked in dried blood, her throat opened with precision. Not rage. Not chaos. But method. A single, clean incision from left to right. Her skull showed signs of repeated blunt force trauma, likely from a heavy object, possibly the ceramic statuette missing from the fireplace mantel. The crawlspace had been bleached. A shallow basin of chemicals pooled beneath her like a final insult. They'd tried to erase her, physically, biologically, symbolically. And yet, she lingered. On her phone, still warm in her pocket, there was a voice memo. A 5-second recording, timestamped 2:59 a.m. In it, Yelani's voice is shaking, breathless. "Mom is coming. She's not." The clip cuts off. No background noise. No scream. Just that unfinished sentence, forever suspended in the digital ether. She was scared. But not surprised. Back in the kitchen, Xiaodan had not moved. When an officer asked if she knew where Yelani was, she blinked twice and said, "Probably with friends. She tends to sneak out." Dell said nothing. He stared into his teacup like he might drown in it. When they were told the body had been found, Xiaodan closed her eyes for a moment. Not in grief, but as if absorbing confirmation of a calculated variable. Her next words were chilling in their coldness, "Then I suppose she's not with friends." No tears. No panic. Just, acknowledgement. At trial, the prosecution would describe the murder as surgical. A crime of preparation, not passion. But it was more than that. It was ritual. Erasure. A final act in a long experiment of control gone terminal. Because for Xiaodan Fang, Yelani was never truly a daughter. She was data. A project. A mirror she couldn't tolerate. A prodigy who had outshined the architect. And Cordell? He was the scalpel she sharpened. The defense would attempt to argue mental illness, dissociation, even shared psychosis. But no psychiatric term could capture what really happened. Because in the end, Yelani's only crime was existing too brightly under a woman who could not bear her own reflection. The truth, when it came, didn't unravel. It detonated. 3 weeks after Yelani's body was found inside the crawlspace behind the linen closet, a DNA test quietly processed in a county lab came back with results no one expected, except perhaps Xiaodan herself. The sample, taken post-mortem from Yelani, showed zero maternal link to Xiaodan Fang. Zero. Not a mutation. Not a distant bloodline. Zero. The initial theory had been that Xiaodan, unhinged by her daughter's brilliance and their spiraling relationship, had snapped. But this was different. This wasn't just psychological. This was foundational. This was identity-based rot, buried so deep it grew like mold behind the wallpaper of their lives. Investigators dug deeper. Hospital records. Old emails. A forgotten nursing schedule. And then came the second blow. Yelani had been adopted. Quietly. Illegally. 16 years ago, after Xiaodan suffered a brutal miscarriage during her second trimester, what hospital staff described as a complete emotional breakdown followed by obsessive delusions, Dell made a decision. A reckless, fragile, tragically human decision. He conspired with a nurse. Not to adopt a child legally, but to replace one. The nurse, a friend of Dell's from college who owed him more favors than she could count, had access to a newborn girl whose mother died during childbirth and whose paperwork hadn't been filed yet. A perfect ghost. No ties. No family. A blank slate. Dell took that child home. Placed her into Xiaodan's arms. Told her she had made it through. "You were out for a while," he said. "But she's fine. She's perfect." And for a while, that lie held. Xiaodan, still reeling from the loss and awash in postpartum confusion, latched onto the baby as if her mind needed the illusion to survive. She named her Yelani. She projected everything onto her: intelligence, symmetry, discipline. She treated her not like a daughter, but like a second chance at achieving genetic transcendence. A monument to controlled perfection. But the truth was a time bomb. She discovered it 3 months before the murder, entirely by accident. She was updating family medical records after a minor asthma scare at school, something routine. But the blood type flagged inconsistencies. Xiaodan's scientific instincts kicked in. She ran a test at her old university lab, where she still had access. Quiet. Off the books. The result? Devastation. She wasn't Yolani's mother. Not biologically. Not by any strand of DNA. And to Xiaodan Fang, who measured love by cellular legacy and control, that meant she wasn't anything at all. That's when the voice memos started. Dozens of them. Some angry. Some eerily calm. All addressed to no one, and everyone. She walks like me. Talks like me. But she's not mine. I didn't give birth to a daughter. I gave birth to a threat. Another, darker. She is the outcome of deceit. The mirror cracked twice, once in my womb, and again in my mind. The final one was almost soft. Almost maternal. And that made it the most disturbing of all. She thinks I hate her. I don't. I just want the lie to stop growing. I want my silence back. In these recordings, investigators heard a woman unraveling, methodically. Like someone solving an equation they'd avoided for years. Xiaodan wasn't consumed by rage. She was consumed by betrayal. Not by Yolani, but by Del. By the nurse. By biology itself. She had built a life on a scientific lie. And when that lie started outperforming her, outshining her in music, language, empathy, she didn't see a child. She saw a replication error. A better version of herself, unearned. Unauthorized. And that? She could not tolerate. It wasn't just that Yolani didn't share her genes. It was that she was better. Kinder. Brighter. Human in ways Xiaodan had sterilized out of herself long ago. And when Yolani asked her, quietly, one night over dinner, "Mom, do you love me because I'm me or because I'm yours?" Xiaodan smiled. But she never answered. Because by then, she already knew the truth. She didn't see a child. She saw a lie growing into a better version of herself. And in Xiaodan's world, perfection was never supposed to arrive wearing someone else's face. There are clean crime scenes. And then there's what investigators found at 1481, Thistle Oak Lane. From the moment the first forensic team stepped through the threshold, it was clear, this wasn't panic. This was procedure. The air was antiseptic. Not metaphorically, literally. A faint odor of bleach clung to the walls like static. The tile grout had been scrubbed until it shimmered. Not a fingerprint, not a single stray hair, not even the organic residue a human body naturally deposits, gone. Erased with such intensity, one of the techs commented it looked less like a murder and more like a sterile testing chamber after dissection. Except under ultraviolet light. That's when reality flickered through the illusion. Under the refrigerator, behind the molding near the linen closet, small sprays. Barely visible. But consistent. Directional. They mapped a struggle in reverse. Yolani had been dragged, limp, across the hall and pushed into the wall space. A hidden hinge, masterfully disguised behind a panel of towels, revealed the truth. The site of her murder was the attic. And the mistake was barely there, a partial footprint in the dust. Men's size 12, consistent with Dell's shoes. But it was smeared, lacking tread depth, and nearly swept clean. The implication? Whoever went up there had been careful, painstakingly so. But not perfect. Forensics called it lab-grade cleanup. But that was only half the truth. Because in this house, the Real lab was digital. 2 terabytes of encrypted files, hidden in what looked like a crashed external hard drive behind a panel in Xiaodan's bedroom closet, held something chilling. Not just surveillance. Study. Dozens of folders. Named, dated, logged. Subject _Y, behavioral instability 2025 Q1. Note, increased emotional outbursts after cello recitals. Suspected hormonal fluctuations. Monitor closely. There were voice recordings. Xiaodan, narrating like a clinical researcher. 1:13 a.m. Subject exhibiting disorganized sleep pattern. Minor twitching. Dream state vocalizations consistent with emotional trauma. Possible psychosomatic guilt. Hundreds of these. Hours-long logs. Some over ambient background noise of Yelani brushing her teeth. Others while she sat doing homework. One file simply titled, Proof. In it, Xiaodan whispers, low and venomous. Every move she makes is mimicry. She's studied me. Perfected me. And now she's trying to replace me. I see it when she answers the phone. The way she addresses Dell. Like I'm a shadow she's rehearsed over. And perhaps most disturbingly, there were videos. Night vision surveillance. Yelani sleeping. At her desk. Reading. Folding her clothes. The camera angles were deliberate. Hidden inside light fixtures, ventilation slats, and even her cello case. No one would have noticed, until it was too late. Xiaodan had been documenting everything. Not out of paranoia. Not even just an obsession. But conviction. As if this wasn't a daughter. This wasn't a girl. This was a variable. A glitch. An experiment that needed containment. She logged Yelani's weight fluctuations. The changes in her handwriting. Her menstrual cycle. One file analyzed the speed at which Yelani answered math problems compared to Xiaodan's own university data from 20 years ago. She called it intellectual parity risk report. It was madness, but systematic. And that's what made it terrifying. She didn't just kill Yelani. She researched her. Profiled her. Built a case like a prosecutor in a sterile courtroom of one. Each file, each note, each haunting video, another brick in a psychological tomb she constructed long before the murder ever happened. And when the final files were decrypted, timestamped just hours before Yelani's death, the truth emerged, horrifying in its clarity. It ends tonight. I can't live in a world where my failure wears my face. I need silence. I need control. I need order. Xiaodan didn't just plan a murder. She published it. One encrypted recording at a time. The trial was held in courtroom 3A of the Brazoria County Justice Center, a sterile, beige-tiled chamber built more for efficiency than spectacle. But over the 4 weeks it unfolded, that courtroom became a crucible, one where grief, madness, and cruelty were pressed into testimony until only shadows remained. The prosecution called it what it was. Premeditated, methodical, and monstrous. The only moment Xiaodan seemed moved at all was when the sentence was read. Fang-Baskins, life without the possibility of parole. Xiaodan Fang. Death by lethal injection. She didn't gasp. She didn't blink. She smiled. It was faint, barely perceptible. But it was real. Afterward, a local reporter asked her one final question during the perp walk back to the jail van. Why are you smiling? Xiaodan paused. Tilted her head like a curious scientist observing an insect under glass. And then she whispered. Because now, she'll never be better than me again. And with that, she stepped into the waiting van, unflinching, unrepentant, and untouched by the horror she had manufactured. It wasn't grief she wore. It was victory. Not over her daughter. Over the idea of her daughter ever surpassing her. Because for Xiaodan Fang, love was never the goal. Only dominance. And in that courtroom, surrounded by grief-stricken family, stunned jurors, and a media circus echoing her nickname, she believed she had won. The Ice Queen hadn't melted. She had calcified, into something worse. The nation didn't just watch the Fang-Baskins trial. They absorbed it like a slow-bleeding wound. It was the kind of story that doesn't just make headlines. It lingers. It infects. A gifted child, betrayed by the very hands that should have cradled her into greatness. A mother, brilliant and brittle. A father, crumbling and complicit. And a house so silent, no one heard her final scream until it echoed off courtroom walls. Cable news spun it like a psychological thriller. Podcasts dissected the pathology behind Xiaodan's obsession. Psychologists filled airwaves with words like maternal narcissism, displacement rage, perfectionist trauma. Immigrant scholars debated the intersection of cultural pressure and personal unraveling. But no one had answers. Only theories. One roundtable guest said, this was not about evil. It was about a mother whose identity was a house of cards, and a daughter who became the breeze. Another whispered, in some women, motherhood is a gift. In Xiaodan, it was a competition. The nation grieved what Yelani represented, potential, erased. She had no scandal. No rebellion. She had awards. Speeches. Service hours. Letters of recommendation. She was, by every metric, the kind of daughter people dream of raising, and yet she wasn't safe. Not even in her own home. Not even in her own bed, where surveillance cameras watched her sleep like a lab rat. Weeks after the sentencing, Yelani's high school held a memorial in the auditorium. The same one where she'd once performed Vivaldi's concerto in a minor to a standing ovation. Her cello teacher, eyes red and trembling, stood in silence for a full minute before pressing the first note. The music was slow. Funereal. Carried by students she used to tutor. When it ended, her Princeton acceptance letter was read aloud. Dear Yelani Fang-Baskins. We are thrilled to welcome you to the class of 2029. No one spoke during the reading. No one could. Even the air seemed to ache with what could have been. The auditorium doors remained open that night. Alumni sent flowers. Classmates lit candles in the courtyard, spelling out her name beside a single rose and her favorite quote from Frida Kahlo, at the end of the day, we can endure much more than we think we can. But in the silence afterward, that quote felt cruel. Because Yelani endured too much already. She wasn't a serpent. She was a star. And in the end, the only thing she ever threatened, was a mother's fragile pride. And when the nation looked into the mirror of this tragedy, they didn't just see a monster in a lab coat. They saw the cost of perfection. And the children swallowed by it. We tell ourselves that parents protect. That home is where truth lives, and love is unconditional. But the story of Yelani Fang-Baskins forces us to look closer, at the quiet homes, the polished smiles, the curated lives behind cul-de-sac fences. Because in Pearland, Texas, safety wasn't a feeling. It was an illusion. Sterilized. Monitored. Weaponized. Xiaodan wore her motherhood like a mask, white coat, perfect posture, flawless resume. But beneath that mask, there was rot. Insecurity dressed as ambition. Control posing as care. She didn't see Yelani as a legacy. She saw her as an invasion. An upgrade she didn't authorize. And Del. He was supposed to be the anchor. The shield. But he drowned slowly, quietly, until he forgot which way was up and who he was supposed to protect. Yelani's story isn't just a tragedy. It's a study in what happens when brilliance is born into the wrong hands. When love is performance-based. When parenting becomes pathology. So we leave you with this. How do you define family, by blood, or by loyalty? What happens when brilliance outpaces the ego that created it? And how do you spot control, when it smiles and kisses you goodnight? Because sometimes, the monster doesn't hide under the bed. Sometimes, it makes your lunch, signs your field trip forms, and tells you it loves you. Right before it locks the door. Before you go, hit follow. Because this won't be the last time we ask uncomfortable questions. Or shine a light into the darkest rooms of the most beautiful homes. This was the story of Yelani Fang-Baskins. And somewhere out there, another star is flickering under fluorescent light. Wondering if love has conditions.